There's a place on Earth that no country fully owns, a place where the average temperature is colder than anywhere else on the planet, where winter lasts 9 months of the year, and where the sea itself turns into solid ice.
To most people, it barely exists, just a blank white space at the top of the map.
This is the Arctic, and right now, the United States, Russia, and Denmark are sending in warships, filing legal claims at the United Nations, and spending billions of dollars,
all to grab a piece of it.
The Arctic is the resource frontier of the 21st century, and the race to control it has already begun.
First thing to understand is that Arctic is not one kind of prize.
It's actually two stuck on top of each other, and each one alone would be enough to start a geopolitical race. The first is critical minerals. Lithium and cobalt power the batteries in your phone and your car. Germanium goes into computer chips. Gallium is essential for military radar and electronic warfare system that decide modern conflicts before a single conventional shot is fired. And then there are 16 rare earth elements, such as neodymium, dysprosium, and yttrium, which are used inside every electric motor, every guided missile, every wind turbine on Earth. The Arctic seabed holds enormous, largely untouched reserves of all of them.
The scale of demand is hard to grasp without a specific number. Your phone, for example, needs 3.5 grams of lithium. An electric bus needs 400 kilograms of it.
Multiply that across a planet of 8 billion people in the middle of energy transition, and you start to see why a frozen seabed becomes a matter of economic survival. But here's the deeper paradox that rarely gets mentioned. The green energy transition was supposed to reduce the world's dependence on extractive industries. Instead, it has created a new and arguably more complex versions of the same dependence. We are replacing oil with metals, and those metals are, if anything, more geographically concentrated than oil ever was. The Arctic is not a solution to resource dependency. It's the next chapter of it. The second prize is oil and gas. Conservative estimates put somewhere between 13 and 30% of all undiscovered global hydrocarbon reserves beneath the Arctic. Not the reserves we already know about, but the ones we have not even found yet. The United States alone, in a single territorial claim made in 2023, secured access to stretch of seabed thought to hold 50 billion barrels of oil. The entire country burns roughly 7.5 billion barrels per year. That is nearly 7 years of American fuel in one place, previously unclaimed. The fact that this happened quietly with almost no public debate says something about how these decisions actually get made.
But we'll come back to this later. So the resources are there in the Arctic.
Which raises the question that has been generating competent legal briefs, military deployments, and diplomatic cabals for 2 decades.
Whose floor is it?
The answer is governed by a 1982 United Nations treaty called the Law of the Sea. The core principle is straightforward. Every country controls the water and seabed up to 370 kilometers from its coastline. Beyond that, it belongs to no one. But the treaty contains one important exception. If a country can prove that its continental shelf continues past that line, it can claim that additional seabed as their territory.
That single clause of the entire game.
3 massive underwater mountain ridges cut across the Arctic ocean floor, and every Arctic nation has constructed a version of the argument that one of those ridges is geological extension of their own landmass. Russia has spent over 20 years building the scientific case that the Lomonosov Ridge belongs to Russia, which, if accepted, would push its marine border all the way to the North Pole. Denmark argues that the same ridge belongs to Greenland. Canada has its own interpretation. The United Nations Commission of the Limits of the Continental Shelf is supposed to adjudicate these disputes. But there's a structural problem. The Commission can make recommendations. It cannot enforce them. There is no mechanism to compel a country to accept a ruling it dislikes, which means the legal process is about determining who's right and more about buying time while positioning on the ground continues. In the Arctic, as in most geopolitical contests, the country that acts tends to win over the country that argues.
Which brings us to the United States.
As was mentioned before, in December 2023, Washington formally claimed over 1 million square kilometers of new seabed, most of it in the Arctic, an area roughly the size of Egypt. The official justification published in State Department webpage was that America was acting to protect the corals, the crabs, and the marine habitats. The actual reason is visible in the different government documents. a regularly updated list of approximately 50 minerals designated as critical to national security. The position stated plainly is that international law applies when it is useful and does not apply when it's inconvenient. What is remarkable is not that a great power behaved this way.
That is historically unremarkable.
What is remarkable is that almost no other country formally objected.
Because the truth is that almost every other country with Arctic ambitions is operating by the same logic.
Russia has the longest Arctic coastline of any country on Earth. It operates the world's only fleet of nuclear-powered icebreakers, and since the early 2000s, it has been rebuilding the military infrastructure it abandoned when the Soviet Union collapsed, reopening dozens of Arctic bases, deploying ballistic missile submarine under the ice, constructing facilities like the star-shaped Arctic Tree Folly Base, designed to sustain 150 soldiers through the polar winter in complete self-sufficiency. Russia has not been preparing for some hypothetical future conflict over Arctic resources. It has been treating the Arctic as contest territory for 20 years. Alongside the military logic sits an economic one. The Northern Sea Route, the standard shipping lane from Asia to Europe, runs south through the Suez Canal, roughly 24,000 kilometers around or 40 days at sea. The Arctic Road straight along Russia's northern coast covers about 15,000 kilometers and takes 20 days. It's faster, shorter, and far cheaper.
Today, however, it barely functions as a commercial road.
Passage is frozen for most of the year, navigable only with icebreaker escort, and too unreliable for the precision logistics that global supply chains depend on. But the ice is retreating. Serious climate projections now put an ice-free Arctic Ocean somewhere in the late 2040s. When that happens, the Northern Sea Route stops being a frozen gamble
and becomes fastest, cheapest trade corridor between the world's two largest economic blocs.
Russia controls every port along it. Russia sets the transit fees. Russia requires foreign vessels to carry Russian pilots. The military bases and icebreaker fleets being built today are not for today's Arctic. They are for that one. If you wanted to design a single location that concentrated every dimension of the Arctic competition into one place, you would design Greenland. And then you would make it almost impossible to actually use.
Let's start with the resource in it.
Geological surveys suggest Greenland holds 43 of the 50 minerals that the United States has designated as critical to national security. A single uranium deposit in the south is estimated to contain more than all known America's reserve combined. Rare earth elements, zinc, iron, oil offshore, the inventory is extraordinary. But about 80% of Greenland is buried under an ice sheet up to 3 kilometers thick.
Nobody has served what actually lies beneath it.
As that ice continues to melt, and it's melting measurably every decade, it will expose territory that no human has assessed in recorded history.
Greenland is not just a known prize, it's an unknown one.
And that uncertainty makes it worth more, no less, to anyone thinking 20 or 30 years ahead. Now the paradox. Greenland is officially an autonomous territory of Denmark, a country 50 times smaller than the island it nominally governs. The population of the entire island is around 57,000 people. Its economy runs almost entirely on fishing and a single gold mine. Denmark quietly subsidizes roughly half of the island's public budget. More than half of Greenlanders in consistent Poland say that they want full independence. Here's the structural trap.
That independence cannot easily escape.
To extract the mineral wealth beneath the ice would require tens of thousands of imported workers, industrial port infrastructure built from nothing in one of the most remote environments on Earth, and sustained capital investment on a scale that 57,000 people cannot self-finance and that Denmark, a small European nation, cannot credibly provide alone. Greenland is too resource-rich to remain as it is and too small to become what its resource would require. It needs a patron with industrial capacity, capital and strategic motivation. The competition to become that patron between the United States, which has maintained the military presence on the island for over 80 years, and China, whose investment approaches have been quietly blocked under American pressure, is not really about Greenland's future. It's about who controls the extraction, who sets the terms, and who gets to decide what happens to one of the last genuinely unknown resource supplies on the planet. There's a version of this story where the Arctic is protected, preserved by international agreement, kept as wilderness, left alone. The problem with that version is that it has no historical precedent. A century ago, fleets of ships hunted whales in these same waters to near extinction, for the straightforward reason that burning whale fat in lamps was profitable. They stopped only when petroleum turned out to be cheaper.
The Arctic was not spared out of a principle.
It was spared because extraction cost more than it was worth. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is no longer truth. Ice, Arctic lost and only showed, is melting.
And the question this century will answer is not whether or not the Arctic will be extracted. It will be. The question is, who will be holding the drill?